Welcome to another episode of the Misal podcast. In this 44th episode and the first episode of the year, I am joined by Ariba Shahid. She's a journalist and covers the economy for profit and startups for DealStreetAsia. As you very well know, Pakistan is at a tipping point when it comes to economy. So I thought, why not talk to someone who understands both the economy as well as startups. We start off by talking about the economy, what happened in the year 2022, and what she thinks might happen in the year 2023. And then we move on to talk about startups in terms of funding, as well as the investor sentiment and the issues the startups are facing right now when they try to raise money. Let's listen in. Welcome to the Misal podcast again, Ariba. How are you?
I feel like that has really flown by because it's been a year.
The last time you were on the podcast was, a year ago, and you were still relevant. And you didn't have that controversy yet. So I wanted to know, how did that change your life? Or if it did, then how did it help your career?
Okay, so that's really interesting because when that happened, I guess this was like 4 to 5 days before Eid. And I didn't really tell my parents. I mean, how do you tell your parents, hi, mom, I'm irrelevant? I didn't really tell my parents. But my dad went to the masjid, to pray. And everyone's like, you need to tell your daughter to tone it down. And he's like, what? She just tweets stock market's not an indicator of the economy. And then my mom starts getting phone calls from her friends. They're like, we saw Ariba's tweet. And my mom was like, and that is now why there is a new Twitter account called @Ariba's mom to make sure I stay relevant. Please follow Ariba's mom.
You had less than 20,000 followers, and I think I think now, or maybe you had more, but now you have almost 50.
I had more. I know this because, and it's really embarrassing, but I know I had more than 20 because I hit 25 in 2021, and I was about to buy the 2 and 5 balloons, the foil balloons.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's why I know I was more than 25 when 2022 started. But yeah, it's almost 50, man.
Yeah. So, but then again, it started off with someone calling you irrelevant, and then someone called you immoral. So you had quite a year, right?
When did the immoral thing happen?
Recently, when someone I think you were on a panel with someone, and someone said,
yeah, that happens. See, I told you, sorry.
You need to remember your controversies.
I told you, there's just so many. Yeah, no, man. I spoke to someone. I asked a question. Cancel me.
Yeah. No, I mean, the Twitter, Pakistani Twitter is it's a whole different league. But
it is.
Yeah.
And also yes, I don't have to agree with someone 100% to have a conversation with them. And yes, some people are not worth having a conversation with at all. And yeah.
So let's talk about some heavier issues. So Pakistan economy, it did not do as well as people had hoped, at least in 2022. A lot of issues, political and macro issues. So if you could just recap what happened in the economy in 2022, and what do you think is going to happen in 2023? Because I know there's a lot of talk about a run on the bank and dwindling foreign reserves and all that stuff.
So it's really interesting. I mean, it's not interesting. It's really depressing. But we started off the year in January 2022, where we had not heard the word default in mainstream media for a while. And it was, things weren't great, but we hadn't heard the word default. The war on Russia and Ukraine was about to start. A lot of people at that time were like, oh my God, the war is going to start and commodities are going to rise internationally. It's going to be bad for Pakistan as well. And that's what happened. On I think February 24th, the war began and commodity prices skyrocketed. But at the same time, Pakistan's internal turmoil started to rise and shine. We've never had a prime minister complete term. So, old habits die hard. We didn't let a prime minister complete a term this time as well. That, while being a political issue, is a very strong economic issue because of that vote of no confidence shebang. The PTI, maybe if this whole vote of confidence thing would not have happened, would have not froze the petrol prices, would have not given a subsidy on fuel prices. If that did not happen, the next few months, there may not have been as much of a pressure on the reserves, adding to the current account deficit, adding to, the whole rupee crisis that we have seen in the next few months. And then moving on, the government changed, a new government came in. That government's indecisiveness with regards to increasing fuel prices also added to it. And then the difficulty in getting back into the IMF program, with that same deal, that added to it. So we had one review earlier this year. We finally got through it after jumping through hoops. And we were supposed to have another one in October this year, end of October. And despite what everyone says that, it's Christmas time and it got delayed because of Christmas, truth be told, it should have been done before winter break. And that just shows you how serious things are. The rupee has depreciated at max 60%, but then it was somewhat managed and it was brought back. But at its lowest point, it was probably 60% since the start of the year. And I'll give you some context. When a friend of mine who earns in dollars started their job in January when the dollar was around 150, and the highest dollar rate that this person got their salary in is at 240. So technically, this person got a really nice raise during the year. But then more importantly, the final thing to summarize on is like inflation. Inflation has been a persistent issue for Pakistan for the past few years. And when I say persistent issue, I mean inflation has roughly been more than 5 to 6% throughout the past 3 years. And that means that every month, the prices rise by that amount. It may slow down at the speed at which it's rising, but it's still rising. And this year, it crossed the 20 mark. We've had inflation up to 26% in the past few months. And that is despite that 26% is despite a lot of controls that are happening in the economy as well. So it's been a crazy year, and we've survived, and we have not defaulted yet. But the run on the bank seems very imminent, especially today speaking, because I'm actually really not excited, but I'm going to be watching the banks tomorrow because of what Dar said over the weekend. I mean, I've never been this busy at work, and this year has kept me really busy.
So there's a lot going on in terms of default. Like everyone is always asking, when is Pakistan going to default and stuff. I just wanted to also ask you one thing about the 2022. How did it help by any means getting off the grey list, the FATF?
The grey list thing is one interesting, because the grey list thing helps, with money coming into the country, out of the country. And it's very interesting because why would anyone want to invest in a country right now where there's so much political uncertainty, because you don't know whether you're going to have an election, you're not going to have an election, you're going to have a technocratic government, you're not. The policy decision-making is not consistent. You don't know whether this country is going to meet its external debt obligations or not. So for a foreign investor, it doesn't seem like a lucrative option right now. So even with Pakistan being a whitelist country, it's not one of the top priority country. And also, another thing to add out is that despite getting out of the grey list, it also means that, repatriation of funds would be easier. But that's not really easy these days. There's so much FX control in the country that that dissuades investors from coming in. I mean, if someone invests in Pakistan and they're unable to take their money out of the country, I mean, I'll just give you an example. IFC exited Bank Alfala earlier this month, and they were not able to exit. They had to do it through the PSX, and Alfala did a buyback. And that's because the state bank was concerned about assumingly the state bank was concerned about FX leaving the country at this point. So with all of these things in mind, yes, the FATF thing is great for Pakistan in the long run, but did we take advantage of that in 2022? No way.
For 2023, what do you think will be one of the things that will either dominate the media or like one of the concerns that you might have? I mean, default is one of the concerns, but is there anything else that, let's just say the default doesn't happen? Like what is going to get better this year?
To clarify, I don't think we're going to default because technically to default, you have to be like, oh, I can't pay your obligation. You don't meet the obligation. We don't have such an obligation that we can meet right now. So we're not going to default, but we are in hot water and we need the IMF program. To be very honest, what I see in 2023, the major trend is we're already on a monetary tightening cycle. The interest rate is at 60%. At 16%, the cost of capital is so high, you're rarely going to see growth, especially in a country where already the banks loan out just to the government in the form of T-bills and VIBs. So you've already got that problem. And now you aggravate it by a 16% interest rate, which I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a 16% interest rate. I'm just saying that when it rains, it pours. And despite a fall in global commodity prices, I don't really see inflation receding in Pakistan immediately or in the near future because our taxes are going to rise, especially because of the IMF program we're in. The flood has been devastating for Pakistan. And even though the flood has been devastating, you can't really use it as an excuse to be fiscally irresponsible. And truth be told, Pakistan in the past, whenever there's been a natural disaster, we've got substantial support. This time around, our support has been very contingent on conditions or subject to approval. So it just shows that, I mean, I don't want to sound very bleak, but what I've answered in the past two questions also signify that there is an image issue with Pakistan. Now, that image issue is not a terrorism and crime or violence issue that we had in the past. The issue is we are fiscally irresponsible. That is the issue that is generally out there.
When you see that, okay, there's a lot of talk about the default, right? So let's just say, for example, for me, when I hear the word default, I feel like, okay, the obligations won't be met, like the loans, the payments won't be done on time. And that would result in, like, I don't know, maybe an increase in interest rate for those payments, or like, a complete, restructuring of those loans if that comes to, at that point. But what's happening right now is mostly like a Ponzi scheme, right? Like it's run sort of like a Ponzi scheme where you take money from someone and then you give it to someone else. And eventually that will have to stop. And in order for that to stop, there has to be some kind of, economic policy within the government. And for me, from the outside, of course, I look at these things and I'm like, okay, export is the only thing that should be focused on, because if you increase the exports, you get the dollars that you really need to pay off these loans, because you borrow these loans in dollars. So are there any other ideas being floating around as to how to get out of this turmoil besides, like, take money from here and give it to this person?
In terms of restructuring, so Pakistan's domestic debt is pretty much manageable. It's mostly locked into long term. Pakistan's short-term debt, Pakistan's external debt, on the other hand, if you look at the breakup of our debt, there are lots of multilateral agencies that we've borrowed from. So restructuring that is very difficult. So you've got that problem. And in addition to that, the countries that we do have loans from, or the countries that we do have ties with, these countries are also the countries that actually would provide rollovers rather than letting us default on it, or grant extensions. But the long-term fix is primarily a debt management strategy. And interestingly enough, the finance ministry does release a document called Debt Management Strategy. And they worked extensively on this for the domestic debt, but they didn't do much about the external debt management. And that is also because, again, in Pakistan, you've got your imports and you've got your exports. You've got a current account deficit. Our exports are not more than our imports. You've got a current account deficit. And in addition to the current account deficit, you've got payments to make. So to make those payments, you need to borrow more. There is no other thing because one, we already run a deficit. Two, we don't have any other sources to bring the money. So the matter remains that to keep Pakistan's economy afloat, your geopolitical ties need to be really important. So I feel that the foreign ministry is as important as the finance ministry at this point.
Is there something that you think that the average Pakistani consumer doesn't understand about how this thing works? And if you could talk to that person, how would you explain it?
So for instance, like the default problem. If Pakistan, God forbid, ever defaults, and I really hope we never default, sovereign above everything. If Pakistan ever defaults, it's bad. Think Sri Lanka, but think of what happened in Sri Lanka. Think of the fact that one, they didn't have any money. I was in Nepal in May this year, and I met with some Sri Lankan journalists. And when they were flying to Nepal, they were allowed $200 at max, or $100 at max, if I remember right. Imagine traveling out of your country with $100. That is how bad it gets. And I mean that's the first world problem. Like, you're traveling, but no fuel, getting in lines for gas, getting in lines for petrol, getting in lines for energy related things. I mean, there's one thing where your power goes out for a few hours, and there's one thing where you have no fuel to generate power for days. Think rationing. So that is one problem that happens when defaults happen, and that is why we should hope and pray we never default. But that is also why we need consistent policy making, and why, regardless of who's in government, whether you support the person or whether you don't support the person, if they're making the right choice, make it easier for them to make the right choice. Make it easier for them to increase taxes. Make it easier for them to increase petrol prices. And I feel the media needs to do a good job at this as well, because a lot of times things are made masaladar, but there is no context added. That is something that we need to work on as a country collectively. And I feel like people like you who create these podcasts, who create these conversations, are actually doing better than a lot of traditional media outlets out there.
Yeah, I mean, the traditional media in Pakistan is, of course, a lot of sensationalism and all that stuff. And that's why, I mean, if I were working at any of these media companies, I would look at all the podcasts that are out there and see like what is working, like what are people actually listening to, and have something similar. But I think it's just the news bites, sound bites, and talking about sensationalism and exaggeration for like little things and all that stuff. So hopefully that gets better, but that's not something that you and I can control, right? So that's something we let people or the audiences decide where they want to spend their time. And I think as audiences move more towards, news that's more context driven, I think that will change over time. Okay. So I have a bunch of questions here, and some of them are really funny, but I'm not gonna, waste your time with that. It's just me thinking out loud. Stuff. But one of the questions I had here is like, will you blame yourself if Pakistan defaults? So yeah.
Would I? Yeah. I blame myself for everything, so maybe.
Yeah. So when it comes to startup funding, so you cover a lot of startups too. You break funding, announcements and all that stuff. So you probably saw a trend this year in terms of startup funding. We had a couple of major failures, and while mergers and acquisitions increased a lot this year, which is very rare in Pakistan, at the same time, funding kind of dried up towards the end of the year. Still a little bit better than last year, but you could see that the investor confidence is not as much as it was before. So when you talk to founders now, what are their biggest concerns?
Inflation, and not just, locally it's inflation, but more is like, man, what are we going to do in our next round? It's getting tough. And it's very funny. So I spoke to a few people that have been raising funds, and everyone had the same answer. Ariba, we get a 30-minute phone call on Zoom or whatever, and in that 30-minute phone call, we spend 10 minutes explaining a specific startup that went bust. In the next 10 minutes, we explain a specific startup that forged documents to the state bank. And in the remaining 10 minutes, we explain Pakistan's current economic situation. When do we bid? So that is what everyone is saying. And I'm not saying that like no one's interested in Pakistan. What I'm saying is someone from outside or someone who's investing their money, their funds' money, would obviously have these questions. And if they do not ask you these questions, then they're not a good investor. So it's not skepticism or it's not them overinflating a problem. It's a genuine concern. Why did one of your biggest startups, one of the most successful startups, and I did the air quotes not because I'm being sarcastic, but it made it seem like it was one of the most successful startups in the country. Why did they go bust? Why did one of the most valued startups with great investors, why did that have to forge a document with the state bank, and why did the state bank have to take back their principal license? These are genuine questions. And then other questions like, hey man, like how many prime ministers are you going to change this year? Like if we invest in you, like what's up? And also like, if we ever want to get our money back, can we? These are genuine questions from an investor. And as a founder, you have to explain these questions. And then you've also got to explain how it's viable to work in Pakistan or to build for Pakistan despite all of this. So these are some general trends that everyone that has raised has told me about.
One thing that I've noticed is a lot of founders are raising money, but they don't want to announce, and they want to like go on as much as they can before announcing. And why do you think that's happening?
Nazar.
Okay.
It's not really Nazar. I mean, it could be.
It could be.
You never know. It's Pakistan. No, it's not really that. In general, a really interesting trend I witnessed this year. A few startups came up to me to announce the rounds, and those rounds were, I mean, they didn't disclose the amount, but they announced that they raised, and they shared the details with me of how much they raised and what, but they just didn't let me write how much they raised, which is fine. And another trend is, "Bata nahi hai." No, keep it a secret. Another. But no, jokes aside, you're right. It is something I've noticed this year, and I'm assuming it's because it's more like, I mean, a lot of founders I've talked to this year, they're like, you know what, we just want to quietly work, just want to sit down, put our heads down and work. We don't need to like make fuss over the round. I mean, people will find out. We're not keeping it a secret. We're just not publicizing it. But interestingly enough, there's one startup, there's one fintech specifically, that was not planning on announcing its round at that point, probably, but it was not announcing it. But they were speaking about it in conversations privately, like, hey, we've raised and we brought in Sequoia, or we have this, right? And they would say this in private conversations. They just didn't announce it in the news. And apparently they had to announce it in the news, and this is based on hearsay, but apparently they had to announce it in the news because after Airlift closing down, they were having trouble hiring top talent. This is what a source said. So they're having trouble hiring top talent. They did hire top talent. There's just like, reluctance. People were not averse to the idea. They're just a little reluctant. Should I not? They're thinking about it. So they're like, you know what? Listen, we've raised a massive round. Great investors. We mean business. So some people announced because they had no choice, but there was a reluctance to announce this here. And you're right. I mean, as a journalist, I was like, why are they hiding this? This is good news. I mean,
I was going to tell you the same thing that, for me, the biggest reason to announce is for talent, to attract talent. No one wants to go work for a startup that has just, raised undisclosed amount of money. I mean, what the hell does that even mean, right? Undisclosed amount of money. But yeah, I feel like, more and more startups do need to announce, because if they don't, when you're building a startup in Pakistan, you are not just, beholden to your investors and, customers and employees. You are also doing something for the ecosystem at large. And if those numbers don't make it to the reports that, a lot of people put out, including me, you are not helping yourself, because sooner or later, maybe you don't need that support right now, but a couple of years down the road, you will need to raise another round. And at that time, it will be easier if there was enough data for you to support that, okay, these are the startups that raised money, this is what the amount was, these are the number of deals. So these things really help ecosystem at large. And I really wish more and more people would disclose the amount of money they're raising.
And it's not just a personal bit, it's more of like, it not just helps the startup itself, it gives a very nice signal of the ecosystem. I mean, we raised 355 million in disclosed deals. Like if we add the undisclosed deals to this, it would be more. It would give a nice signal that, okay, fine, we've raised more than last year, even though we have a bad economic situation within, and there's a global liquidity crunch. So those two things, and we still managed to raise more. Right now, we've just inched above, but with the undisclosed deals, I'm assuming it would have been a lot. I mean, I'm assuming maybe 10, 15 million more max, maybe 15 more. But there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions happening this year, and those were disclosed, but they didn't disclose at what value they bought. I mean, batao yaar, gossip though.
I would agree with the acquisition part, because I personally, this is just my opinion, the acquisition numbers or the amounts are so embarrassing that they don't want to disclose. So I think it's more about embarrassing part, like, GoZion acquiring Find My Adventure. It was an embarrassingly low number.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's why they didn't disclose it. So same thing goes with, I think, those Bagallery acquiring some startup. And so those are like really like minuscule numbers. I would say like maybe higher 6 digits number. It's less than $1 million. DigitalOcean was big. That was big. That was definitely big. I've heard a lot of rumors about what happened to the founders afterwards.
I saw the Twitter thread, but I also saw them at the BSX, like I mean in pictures, so I'm confused. Like
things that I've heard was like they had to initially leave the country and then come back, and like a lot of things were going on there too. So it's like also because there's absolutely no way. DigitalOcean is a public company, so if a public company acquires a company, any company, they have to disclose the amount. It will just be on their financials, and there was no way around it, because if I feel like if they had their own way, like they could do something, Cloudways could do something about it. They would be like, please do not disclose the amount.
Yeah.
Because this will get us into a lot of trouble. Yeah. Nazar, of course. Nazar. Okay. So let's do predictions. What is your prediction for 2023? What is one thing that you feel like might happen? And if you could tell me what you think the startup funding would be for 2023.
We might have Series C come in, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay.
Not very confident. I mean, it is time, but maybe, hopefully. I don't know. I'm not predicting this, but I would be very interested. I think May or April 2022, Coesis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, was looking to list on the Pakistan GEM board. It's a really strong tech startup, Pakistan German startup. It was looking to list on the GEM board. The GEM board is the growth enterprise market. It's for smaller businesses and tech businesses primarily. It's like the star market. And it's going to help smaller businesses raise capital, lower regulation, lower listing fees, lower cost of listings. I would really like to see a tech startup list on the GEM board, so that founders think, okay, fine, I have venture capital, but I could also list to public markets. While the GEM board does have its weaknesses, that is an interesting angle I would hope to see. Similarly, this year, I don't know, I predict 420.
420 million?
We hit 355 this year. I don't know, I'd say 400.
400. Okay. You are way more optimistic than I am. I am going to say 150.
And the only reason I'm saying 400 is because this is under the assumption that the startups that we have continue to go and they raise next round. So the early stage ones move on to later stages. But I do see a lot more consolidation happening this year. I feel that founders have realized, listen, the market is tough. Investor ka masla ho raha hai. There's a lot of consolidation that we see coming in. I spoke to a few lawyers that work on the side, And they're like, yeah, man, deals are coming in. So more than rounds, I would say there's more of consolidation coming in this year.
So I think Bazaar has raised Series B, right? So Bazaar is the only one that would be readying for like Series C. And there are a couple of other Series B startups, I can't think of it. But there's Bazaar, there's Abhi. So Bazaar raised last year. So that means
17.
it has like, it has like a couple of years before it raises Series C. That's what I would think. Abhi also raised last year, but this is funny that you mentioned that gem board. So there was someone I was talking to, I won't name that person, but he's an investor. So I was talking to him and he is like, can you please explain to me how exactly will a startup in Pakistan, go to gem board and, go public? Because he gave me an example that I actually, at the time, I was like, it was my mind was blown, but I had to look into it and he was almost right. So he gave me an example of Abhi. He's like, Abhi is like publicly valued at $100 million, let's just say.
Yeah.
And he's like, Askari Bank or some bank he named.
Yeah.
He's like, Askari Bank is worth $100 million.
Yeah.
So he's like, do you really think, a startup like Abhi or any other startups, I'm not picking on Abhi, but I'm just saying any other startup that's valued at that amount, like, do you really think they will go and list on, Gem Board or, Pakistan Stock Exchange and be valued at the similar price as Askari Bank? And I'm like, of course not. And I'm like, Abhi is a completely different ballgame because I feel Abhi is a lot bigger than what they are in Pakistan, and the market for it is huge in the Middle East. And I think that's where they're going. So they will never be listing on Pakistan Stock Exchange. So they will be okay, right? But he did like point me to think in the terms that, okay, all these startups that are so highly valued, they have to compete if they ever go public on the Pakistani Stock Exchange. They have to compete with the likes of like these banks that are valued at the similar price point. So that was very interesting.
So when I spoke to the chairman, not the chairman, sorry, the CEO of the PSX, CEO, MD, same thing, I guess. So when I spoke to Farooq Khan, he was like, the Gem board will provide a basis of valuation, like, एक होता है, you get it, evaluation from an external thing, right? एक होता है through the stock exchange. Because like it's going to help make realistic valuations a thing, which I see. The problem is the public markets in Pakistan are too small and they're too concentrated and they're too shallow for even their valuations to be seen as the right valuations. So the banks, I'm assuming our banks are undervalued, and maybe these startups are overvalued, overinflated valuations. So there is that. And yes, the chances of Abhi listing on the Pakistani Stock Exchange or any startup with a bigger valuation than a major bank listing is very slim. But this would probably be for the ones that aren't as famous and aren't as publicly valued. So this is a good viable option for them, especially the SMEs. But again, the depth of the market is so shallow that it might not ever take off. That is a major concern. And no, a lot of startups, for instance, I mean, you don't even need to think about startups. Like let's talk TRG. TRG is a tech company in Pakistan, right? They've listed in Pakistan, but they're also like internationally, like TRG International, TRG Pakistan. And they keep the best prized assets out of Pakistan. A startup listing on a gem board is a really long shot. But if it happens, I mean, if one person leads the way, maybe it might be seen as an avenue investment. I mean, look, your interest rate 16%. Borrowing capital is very expensive. What are you going to do? You've got to develop your public markets. Venture capital has to flourish. Local VCs need to step up into venture capital as well. And when I say local VCs, I mean local investors need to spend. Local investors need to step up. We need to get local perspectives into the game as well, because, I don't know, someone sitting in Chicago doesn't understand Pakistan maybe the way someone sitting in Sargodha does. And I'm not even saying someone in Karachi. I'm just saying someone throughout Pakistan. I feel local investors really need to step up.
When it comes to a lot of startups, like, the way the startups are, like, they raised money in the previous years, is there something that you are seeing different in terms of like the markets that they're going after or the products that they are building because of the way things have changed?
Good startups will always manage to sustain themselves. Of course, yes, sometimes they're going to be like, they're going to hit some roadblocks, but solid business ideas, solid fundamentals, solid ideas that are out there solving real problems or addressing a real gap in the market, despite the economic hurdles, will eventually find their path. Some might fail for whatever reason, but that doesn't mean the idea was bad. I personally feel that quick commerce, for instance, is not a bad idea. I mean, there are better ideas out there, but maybe Pakistan's just not ready for it right now. It might be the best idea in the future. I think Pakistani founders are resilient founders. We were the nation that, I mean, if you've grown up through and through Pakistan, you've suffered through countless crises after crises. You're mentally like, you know what? Okay, we'll deal with it. Like, so I feel that Pakistani founders are resilient. We're a very resilient nation, and good founders will continue to get funded. They may fail, but they'll step back up and they might start again, or they might rekindle it all over. Speaking of which, I've heard a Sunken founder is raising again.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I mean, good founders, like you said, will always be able to raise money. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, as long as you are a good founder and you have that network. I think ideas are not that important when you have a great network of people betting on you.
To be very honest, it was a great year to see mafias coming up. Like the Kareem Mafia was a thing, right? But now we've got Bazaar Mafia, we've got Airlift Mafia, we've got this. So the spillover onto, I mean, we started off very bleak, Zahid, but like a good thing to end on is that there's hope. We've got a young generation that's out there that wants to do stuff and doesn't want to join. I mean, it doesn't want to just do the run-of-the-mill 9 to 5. They actually want to do something else.
As far as the mafias are concerned, I feel like Kareem might be the only one that is an actual mafia. In Pakistan, if you talk about like, ex-Bazaar or ex-Airlift, it's not really a mafia because Airlift never went public. Bazaar never went public. So it's not considered, they say, I don't want to use this, Mahavra, but, Andho mein Kada Raja. So that's something that is basically happening, I feel, is because there's not that many success stories. Like we are clinging on to something that is very, very close to it in terms of success story.
There's a thing called Nixer Mafia. And Azad, are you from Karachi?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, so the Nixer College is an A-level college and there are lots of startup founders from there. So there's a thing called Nixer Mafia and there's a thing called St. Michael's Mafia. I mean...
So there is no Lums Mafia?
No, they will consultant bante hain.
But honestly, like I was looking at the numbers.
I don't know, there might be one.
Yeah, there has to be one because there are quite a few people that I've spoken to or funded founders. Turns out that Ghuma Phira ke, they have some kind of a Lums connection. And it's like, okay, that's interesting to see because here where I live, everyone is like has a Stanford or Berkeley connection. So it's very common. You meet people like, they're like, I was able to raise money because of this happened. And it's like, I had friends at Lums and they connected me with people and all that. So there's a lot of that going on too, which is a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Yeah. Well, I know I've taken a lot of your time and thank you again for being on the Misal podcast for the second time and answering the questions, and hopefully things turn out to be better in 2023.
Has anyone ever been on the podcast twice?
Yes, you are the third person.
Okay, has anyone been on the podcast thrice?
No.
Okay.
Not yet.
Goal for resolution.
So you need to come back in, let's do a recap in the half of the year. So June, July. Sounds good.
But when you do 3 podcasts, Zahid gives you a Misal podcast mug. That is the rule.
Okay, sure. I'll send that to you.
This was fun.
Thanks for listening to the Misal podcast. I hope you enjoyed the podcast and will thank me by writing a review or sharing it on social media. Make sure you follow and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Thanks again. See you soon.